Hi, my name's Rachel, and I'm talking for our Mythical Nature on the frailty of sublunary things, classical myth, pedagogical media, and moral education in the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm going to try and do one take. It's possible the dogs will contribute. Right now they're sleeping, so let's hope that that bit of nature is quiet. So this is drawn from my research into 18th and 19th century children's culture. And we're going to be using educational toys, books, and games to discover how children encountered classical myth through nature and vice versa. And most of these encounters were ephemeral, serendipitous, and accidental. So the context is usually not specifically to learn about classics. It's moral education, some religious education, and the classics and the nature are bound up together in that. Just a quick reminder of my research context for those of you who don't know me. I'm writing a book about children's classics between 1750 and 1914, mostly in Britain, some European and American context as well. And the chapter breakdown, most of the material today is linked to chapters 2, 3, and 4. So looking at cultural literacy along with classics. And some of the sorts of things that I do look at are learning to read and write, so alphabets and writing blanks. But the things we'll look at today are complementary to those, so more about the making sense of the images and the moral messages that are behind them. But that's the context in case anyone didn't know and wants to ask more. So today for our mythical nature, I want to think about how and why is nature linked with classics, and what is the combination used to communicate? What does the natural world look like in these media? So is it ancient or contemporary or timeless? How does this fit with wider societal values? So moral education, religion, but also we'll see a running thread of politics and imperial identity. And over on the right, I've popped the image that I've used as my background. So we'll find out more why that plant is an emblem of purity. So first of all, looking at Aesop, this is the most obvious example of children encountering nature while learning classics. And there's some beautiful examples here that I thought I would share, mostly in a naturalistic style. So here an example of quite cheap books because the print is squashed together and the images are cheap woodcuts. On the right, they've been coloured in quite badly by a child. And then over to card examples, so an interactive media combined with an alphabet, but again, naturalistic looking foxes. Walter Crane's gorgeous painting book, so the coloured plates on the one side are how it was published, and then you could copy that on the blank side opposite. And jigsaws, again an interactive media, and also with very naturalistic pictures of foxes and birds, and a board game. So this is the Trial of Aesop. It's a spiral race game, but at each playing point you get an image, the title of one of the fables and the moral. And again, the images are naturalistic. So recognisable animals, and again in these American advertising cards from the end of the 19th century or possibly beginning of the 20th. And on the reverse of the image side, you get the story, the moral, and the adverts, which are put at the bottom of that image. So you get a similar range of media looking at pantheons and emblems. So these mostly focus on explaining who the gods are, and etiological stories, creation myths, and that sort of thing. So Choice Emblems is the book that we're going to look at in more detail. But here are some of the card games. So celestial games, linked to looking at astrology on the left-hand side of this image, and then Pantheon and Heathen mythology cards, which were focused on the mythical stories of the gods and goddesses, not necessarily linked to astronomy. And a German example here, the catalogue isn't quite sure, but possibly from the 1820s. This one doesn't have much in the way of landscape. It focuses more on the figures. And again here, a French example focuses more on the figures with a blank background behind them. So on to Wynne and choice emblems. This was written in 1772 for a 9-year-old and is explicitly called for the instruction of youth. And when it was reprinted in 1793, so in the 7th edition, this verse was put at the front. So a verse addressed to Wynne and talking about how the moral is plain. And what I found intriguing was the idea that although he's talking about the frailty of sublunary things, this editor thought that the emblems, labours like thine, will wear old time away and live when lofty monuments decay. So this will outlast, he thinks, the monuments which Wynne describes as perishing. And then the other intriguing thing for me is that the ancient sage of other times he's mentioned is Aesop. So sacred truth in various fables dressed, until more enlightened days, i.e. the 18th century Christian tradition, explained his morals and ensured his praise. So there's a link seen here between emblems and fable. So explaining where I got my title from, the final emblem of this book, there's a lot of text here, and there's a lot of text in the book as well. This is the verse, so the lofty pile that reared its head so high, the boast of ages, and it falls. And then we get the essay which explains that this is linked to man. So remember, O man, the frail state of thy mortality. Running through some ancient empires, including Rome, and saying, where are those cities? There's not even a stone left. And then quoting Shakespeare's Tempest. So this is the bit about the insubstantial pageant faded, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself. And then he segues from that quote into virtue. So virtue is the only thing which will last, and therefore that's what should be cultivated by a person rather than possessions. Now this is illustrated by an oval emblem, which is standard for these emblem books, but you can see it changes between editions. So on the right is the 1772 edition from Princeton, and on the left is a 1775 edition from Google Books. And there's a key difference, which is that the monument has fallen over by the later edition. There's a similar amount of landscape. So you can see the hills behind and some pyramids, as well as a palm tree here. In this one, there's a bit more of a built environment and some cluttered tributes in the foreground, some armour, but you still have a tree. I think it's a more Western British looking tree, and some more rolling hills rather than pyramids. But of course the key difference is that here the lofty pile is still rearing its head. The set out of these pages is standard, so there's more space than on the squashed Aesops that we saw. You get the emblem first, then the title, then a verse, the moral explained, and then an essay. There's more nature in Wynne than just those ruins. There's some plants as well. And one of the striking ones is the one that I used as my backdrop, which is the sensitive plant. And it's described as constructed by nature to shrink from the warmth of human touch. And this is so strange that there were some stories told of this wonderful vegetable. And the moral is that you should shrink like the plant in the emblem whenever vice approaches. Shrink from sin. So the plant in question is the Mimosa pudica. I couldn't get a video to upload in this format, but I found an image that shows what happens. So if you touch the plant really gently even, or run your finger down it, when it's open like it is on the left, then it shrivels up as on the right for quite a while. And it's not a very slow thing like a prayer plant that closes when it's dark. it's responding to the touch very quickly. And that's what's illustrated here. So I think the shock is why his right hand is raised up. And then you can see he's sort of gingerly poking at the plant with his left hand. I don't think this is a gardener. I think this is the owner of the garden or the plants, a sort of dilettante who's experimenting with prodding this plant for amusement value. So the moral of the story is to learn to be like the plant. And that's again the moral of Emblem 9. So this is about the sunflower, and we're told the story of the heathen fable of Clytie and Phoebus. And this is turned into an emblem of gratitude because she's been changed into a flower and remembers the regard she once had for him. And that's likened to humans owing gratitude to God, our creator. And then the Anglican liturgy is quoted, in whom we live and move and have our being. And the moral of the story is that we can learn gratitude from brutes and often even from the inanimate part of creation. So learning lessons from plants as well as from animals. So taking it a step further than Aesop, these aren't animals with speech bubbles, but it's just observing natural behaviour of plants. And that's taken further in the emblem of the bee, which is down here. And the bee is shown here on a rose. In the earlier edition, it was in a beehive. And this is made into an example of the art of extracting good from evil, which is not what occurs to me mostly when looking at an industrious bee. But here, plants and flowers are not automatically good, and they're described as even the most hurtful that can be found in nature, and still the bee manages to get pollen. So the moral of the story is that nothing is so bad in nature that we can't get some profit or instruction from it. So an insect and plants this time, but still the powerful lessons to be learnt from observing nature. So in 1830, William Pinnock he revisits the idea of an emblem book. He calls it Iconology, and he has a rather different format. So he goes for these figures. He puts them together in a table of 4 rather than an oval one above each essay. Then there's a lengthy essay after each set of 4 emblems. And then that's followed by some study questions. So it's very much more of an aimed at school type book. But he still ends in the same way as Wynne did, by thinking about ruins and empires as metaphors for human life. And he chooses to show this with an image of an old man, so dressed as an ancient sage, and with a book that's got the letter omega open on his lap. But the text itself seems very influenced by the Huddleston Wynne. So he's talking about kingdoms and empires rising and falling, the Grecian and the Roman empires in particular. And then he goes from that to the power and dominion of England that must also have an end. And he again uses that phrase, sublunary things, 3 lines down in the second paragraph. The other end he's talking about here is a spiritual end or a Christian judgment, and the idea that the destruction of empires is as nothing compared to Judgment Day, to the end of things. And he also says it's not for man to endeavour to pry into the secrets of his maker. So the idea that nature has been created, but is also meant to remain unknowable or unknown. And that's very different from the other contexts in which we come across the natural world, in geographies in particular, which is all about understanding natural phenomena, often using classical examples. So one of the key examples of that is volcanoes. And I've put together a few examples of Etna and Vesuvius as they're encountered in various travel narratives, as well as some classical scenes which come up in a worldwide geographical panorama. So over on the left, over on the right, and we've got Etna and Vesuvius together in a board game, which has got the Colosseum in the middle. This is called the Game of the Golden Shield, and I haven't yet been able to get hold of the instructions that are at Yale. The board game itself is at Princeton. And these images you'll see are very similar to some in a book by Taylor. Almost reused, but not quite, which was quite common at the time. And over on the left, you can see how stereotypical this image is of the explosion of Vesuvius. So this is from the Travels and Adventures of John Bull the Younger, and you can see the rocks coming out as well as the lava. So the pumice stones sort of falling out of the eruption. And it's a very romantic description in this verse. So John Bull stood in silence, overwhelmed with sensations of wonder, although he does tremble when he hears a terrible sound, which is deeper than pealing thunder. But it still seems to be, apart from the terrible verse, a very romantic view. We get a rather different view over here, which is in Maria Hack's Geographical Panorama. This is a toy theatre-like box for geographical education, and the base of the box becomes a stage when you put it together, and there's slots in it, and you can put the backdrop in, which is the temple, and then the other views characters slot in front. The box I used at Princeton was a bit stiff to put together, but then the cardboard slots worked very easily. So I had a lot of fun putting those together, and I've got images of polar bears and tigers and so on if anyone's interested and wants to see more of them. It's very much a journey around the world using stereotypical images, and you get the Parthenon, but you also get this temple in Hermopolis in Upper Egypt, and the camels and the vast landscape here. And it's linked to her book called Winter Evenings. So the traveller who's collapsed from the heat and the wind is described in more detail there. But here we've got the landscape and the ruins and the durability of the ruins as the focus instead. So the fragments of stone and the loose sand of the desert and the camels. So the classical ruins are representative of the landscapes, equivalent in sort of symbolic power to polar bears or girls dressed up in traditional dresses, or boating scenes and so on. And again, it's epitomising ephemera and serendipity in encountering the classical reception. Returning to Pompeii, this book, Relics of Antiquity, which is written by a female author for the use of young persons, she seems to have expanded the whole idea of winds ending. So this is combining travel narrative. So she's describing her trip to Naples and to Pompeii and Herculaneum, and she's describing the catastrophe in minute description. She says minute detail, in fact, much more so than the present appearance of the ruins. But the other intriguing aspect is the ending, where again she uses the phrase sublunary possessions, and we're reminded of how fleeting that is by Pompeii and Herculaneum, so by visiting and by observing the ruins. So the stereotypical visions that I said we'd come back to from the Game of the Golden Shield, this is from Taylor's Scenes in Europe, which is quite disturbing in terms of the text. It's a very prejudiced, nationalistic, almost xenophobic book. But here you can see the jumble of past and present and landscape and man-made, which the tourists are going through. So we have Etna and the description of tourists climbing to the top and getting a romantic sunrise scene for their efforts. And that's the image on the top right here, number 34. And you can see the tiny figures against the enormous volcano, which is still erupting, and there's still hot lava down there. And then Vesuvius, which is described as picturesque, you can see here. And very similarly to the Game of the Golden Shield, you've got the very square buildings in front and the boat, possibly Pliny's boat. And I think the implication that this volcano is less of a romantic view or landscape and more of a threat to the city that's in front. So I said that one was a bit disturbing, and it contained some very anti-Catholic viewpoints. He was an Anglican priest who was writing, and also it's very framed by seeing the point of travel as returning home again. So some threads that I think have run through the uses of nature in this sort of material are religion and nationalism, and anachronism or juxtaposed timings. So looking at the Aesop, we saw that what was at stake in the Aesop was religion and morality, and in these travel narratives that comes to the fore again. So in this image from Taylor, on the top left with the dog, the lesson that he learns is just that there's sulphur in the cave. What we learn from a Quaker female version is that the point of travel is to learn to tolerate different people and different customs. So this is from Wakefield's Juvenile Travellers. And from the Grotto of the Dogs in particular, her children who are touring have indignation and regret. So this is an anti-cruelty point. So there are different views that are going on, and Wakefield's Juvenile Travellers is very different in that regard to Taylor's, and also in religious tolerance. So whereas he's anti-Catholic, Wakefield is more inclusive as a Quaker. Although she does identify superstitious ceremony, she's at least not so intolerant in her outlook. Maria Hack is also a Quaker female writer, and she is influenced by that when she's talking about hieroglyphics. So as a Quaker, there are no priests. The idea is that everybody's got inner light in them and everybody can access God through prayer, and the Bible should be translated into the vernacular. So that's why she's so against hieroglyphics. And again, she is more tolerant of the Turks than some of the other travel writers at the time. And it's the Turkish governor of Athens who appears in front of the Acropolis. So in addition to the religion and morality, I'm going to see if I can find the Empire and Nationalism section. So this is the more disturbing side of the travel narratives. I've put some of these here. I don't think I need to dignify them by reading them aloud. But the natural point here is the White Cliffs of Dover. So the point of these English, imperial, Victorian and Georgian era travel, for most of the authors, not all but most, is that you can return home again, and that is symbolised by the White Cliffs of Dover. And in contrast, the Aesop nature is different. So the lessons here are more timeless and less nationally specific. But there is a bit of a paradox between disguise and masking and nature. So in Proverbs Exemplified, we're told that the truths are naturally dry and unentertaining, and therefore putting morality under a mask and being taught in the form of fables is what makes it more playful. So the natural elements, the animals, constitute a mask for human life here, which is a bit hard to get my head around. And it's then likened to being on the stage and also to a mirror. So the natural is less natural. It's a disguise which is put on for the purpose of pedagogy. And it's also likened to wisdom holding up a mirror to folly. And I think their wisdom is the natural world and folly is the human world. And the lesson is know thyself. A classical motto, which is shown here as a court jester. And as an example from inside these proverbs, he's talking about Nero and how cruelty against nature is a predictor of cruelty towards humans. which is also something that you find on modern detective shows. I think it comes up on NCIS quite a lot. This is a very different image. This is from a beautiful, anachronistically paralleled version of Aesop by Caldecott. And the example of frogs desiring a king is made to talk about home rule in Ireland. And the example of the ass in the lion skin is used to poke fun at art critics. And particularly the coat and the hat are labelled Finkelman and Lessing, so against the whole classical tradition here. And there's a lovely contrast between the animals and the naturalistic illustrations, and then the modern human application. So there was a celestial card called Terra, or the Planet of the Earth. I'm not showing the image because it's not a great image, but the text talks about how nature and the point of considering nature is really human education again. So it's a nice way to wrap up. All of the celestial motives have an associated moral, and for Earth, it's pride and ignorance that for many centuries we've placed the globe we inhabit in the centre of the universe, and supposed that the admirable fabric of the heavens was made only for us. We shall not be surprised to find Terra or Earth raised to the rank of a deity by the heathens. But it continues to say that philosophy has reduced our pretensions and convinced us we're only the lords of a small planet which follows the course of every other sphere. And I thought that was a nice counterpoint to the plants and the ruins that we've looked at. So classical content often appears in natural scientific contexts, and vitally it shows everyday, ephemeral, accidental encounters with Greco-Roman antiquity as a constant presence in 18th and 19th century children's culture. And we've seen various guises of the natural world, so Aesop's animal characters, the romantic landscapes, and the ruins, both literal and metaphorical, as well as ideological and etymological explanations. But the child protagonists, or the imagined readers, and their moral well-being remains the real focus of our mythical nature, in the same way that in this backdrop image, it's the dandy who's trying to tease the plant, who's in the centre of the frame, and his moral education is the subject of the image, not the plants themselves. Thank you.